Back out on the street, the crowd had divined from what little they'd overheard that those burglars were indeed friends of the Emperor, sent on an evil errand of diabolical duplicity to poison the honest people of the Resistance. The tale grew as it passed from one gossiper to another, from the front of the big crowd in the street to the back, until the movement to accept beastmen as fellow citizens had all been a ruse to install spies, and it was a plot by the Emperor to destroy the well-meaning opposition and ensure slavery for all of the honest citizens. By that time, Princess Crystal Mendoza Chisholm-Gibo was dumbfounded, wide-eyed and amazed at how quickly the falsehood became truth. And that was the moment that the people happened to notice her standing behind them. El Fantasmo stood in the midst of the throng with an eye on Cabal's motorcycle, waiting to make his move. An ensorcelled blade hung from his belt which, according to the old sword salesman, could hack its way to it for him, as if reaping stalks of corn. A tempting option, to be sure, but that just wasn't his style. He was more for deftness, le jeu de main, finesse. The agitation of the crowd rose to a furor, and he frowned at the sudden noise. It reminded him of lynch mobs he'd seen in the early moments when people were still uncertain how far they'd go, when all were goaded on by the encouragements of the men beside him, but deep inside still knew it was wrong. Distracted now from the bistro's front and the chopper in the street, the crowd was straining forward, standing on tiptoe and craning their eyes to see someone. He couldn't care less who it was. Another spy, and a welcome diversion. He had to have that bike. No horse could outrun him escaping the city. Once he'd gained the coastline, there was not a scoundrel or a bravo that wouldn't jump at the chance to serve under him. They'd seize control of his ship and leave Navarre in their wake. As the cries rose all about him, more and more men pushing their way to see what was happening, he could sidestep in between them, passing slowly toward the motorcycle. The shouts became more insistent, peppered with cruel laughter. The men jostled him and he ground his teeth. Normally, he considered a misplaced elbow or a rude shoulder as much of an insult as a thrown glove, and would not hesitate to throw down. But in that moment, the stakes were too high. Discretion was the better part of valor. Another step, and some fool bumped into him, passing by without so much as a grunt of apology. Another step, and one more, and he was beside the chopper. How did it work? There had been one in a museum long ago, and there were diagrams. It had to be awakened with a button or a switch. He examined it from all sides. The princess was pushed and pulled and shoved, her great hat torn from her head and her hair tugged free of its pins. An unkind hand or two tore her bodice and the skirt that billowed about her, and she emerged a pitiful sight on the other side. In her fearful eyes was a spark of outrage, but only a spark, outshined by shame. She knew she was going to die, and because of her folly. Her face burned and her eyes stung with tears as she made ready to sell her life as high as she might. She stood trembling, stooped and disheveled, with her hair coming undone, her head bowed. It took a moment for her to muster some dignity, and while she struggled, she opened her eyes a moment and saw him. Him. She froze. Diego da Silva swung a leg over some kind of metal horse, mounting it and adjusting himself to the seat. He stuck his feet into the stirrups, put his hands on the handlebars, thumbed a switch, and glanced her way. Their eyes met. "Remember me," she told him with her eyes. He blinked at her from behind his mask and frowned. "Help me," she implored. It took the longest split second of her life, an eternity, to see recognition flicker in his dark eyes. She was shoved again into the chest of another man, who shoved her back, and when she tried to look at Da Silva again, he was gone. People dove out of the way to escape the spinning blades as El Fantasmo sped down the street. The engine's howl was less discreet than he wanted, because all eyes were upon him, but it was an escape and he couldn't complain. The only problem was that girl's eyes, the way they'd bored into him. It was as if she knew him and expected him to help her. Shaking his head to clear it, he dismissed her from his mind. Trying to remember the way out of town, he swerved onto a narrow side street, splashing through a puddle and shattering the wooden leg of an outdoor table into splinters as he passed. The small table keeled over, spilling someone's cup of espresso and a plate of croissant into the cobbles. An instant later, a stack of wooden crates exploded in chunks and feathers, and a large white chicken squawked angrily, flying away. Poles out in front of shops snapped like twigs and flew, spinning to clatter against the walls, and the awnings they upheld came crashing down behind him. Tables of fruit merchants collapsed, spilling oranges and pineapples that bounced and rolled in the street. "Yep," he thought. Inconspicuous. That's how to do it. And far behind him, Princess Crystal was savagely knocked to the ground. Turning at random from one narrow street to another, and trying not to destroy too much along the way, El Phantasmo finally rolled to a stop. Looking to one side, then to the other, he had to accept that he was thoroughly lost. The buildings were too tall for him to see the sun and judge which way to go, and he had been thinking too much lately about his wedding and the subsequent fiasco to pay attention to landmarks. His breath hissed out between his teeth, and he tried to decide which way to go. Suddenly, the sword at his hip jerked up to point towards the left, like a hunting dog sighting its prey. Looking at it in surprise, he felt it tugging him, urgently. Then, an overripe red tomato splattered on the back of his head. He hunched and glared with one eye over his shoulder. That eye widened an instant before an old shoe sailed past him, an inch from his nose. He squoze the accelerator, the chopper lurching forward, and he just barely escaped a barrage of miscellaneous thrown things. Behind him, an angry mob of shopkeepers, now more hopeless people, and other outraged folks came howling down the street. There were chefs waving cleavers, bakers with rolling pins, serfs with brooms, and many with just their bare hands. Tires squealing, El Phantasmo followed the sword's advice and went left, leaving a long, smoking black skid mark. Somehow he realized he was heading toward the palace, meaning the heart of the city, and he turned left again in a blind panic. Glancing back the way he had come, he saw a flood of people emerging from the street behind him. His eyes narrowed bitterly. Yep, he thought. Finesse. Facing front again, his eyes had time to widen once more before he crashed into the crowd of people he just left. Plowing through them, he hacked men and women apart indiscriminately, the chopper's rotating blades shearing legs out from under all in his path. Bodies piled high between the high handlebars, and faces screamed mere inches from his face. Momentum bore him all the way through the crowd of people to the other side, almost to where he'd started in front of Matisse. One of the chopper's blades sliced into the side of a billowing hoop skirt of a woman. Snagged in the netting that held the skirt's form, the blade dragged her, screaming, along the cobbles until the weight of the dying dragged the chopper down. With a groan of irritation, El Phantasmo fell slowly, hitting the street with less grace than he'd prefer. He was unhurt, but the weight of the chopper and the people upon it pinned his leg underneath. He was trapped. Looking back, he saw the bloody swath he'd cut through a multitude of people, and the shock on the faces of those he'd narrowly missed. He saw that shock turn to rage, and he swallowed hard. Then, the eyes of the woman he'd dragged opened, and he found himself looking at the princess of Alcazaren. Through the pain and fear in those wide eyes, he saw relief and warmth. She parted her cracked and bleeding lips to smile and whisper, "You came back." He frowned, not knowing what she was talking about, and just before the first heel kicked him in the head, she sighed, "You came back for me."